Hello everyone, Mr. Happy here and welcome to Final Fantasy Bestiary. This series is dedicated towards discovering the history and lore behind Final Fantasy's most iconic creatures and characters. In this episode, we will be looking at sandworms. So while I say we're looking at sandworms, this is actually just one type of worm in the Final Fantasy series. Now keep in mind when we say worm, we mean W-O-R-M, not W-Y-R-M, which is a type of dragon. No, we're talking about the slithery ones here, and throughout the years, worm-type enemies have been a regular cause of headaches and secrets as an enemy type that is known to be quite difficult. They are normally Earth Elemental, though they are not exclusively Earth Elemental, and it's very common for that reason for them to have a weakness to water. They're also known for their excessively high health and the Earthquake skill, which, without the float status, will deal massive earth damage to your party. As for how they usually look in a game, well, it's a giant worm. I mean, they have no eyes, sometimes they have spikes or antennae, but ultimately, it's a giant worm most of the time with tons of sharp teeth and an appetite for the cast of whatever game you're playing. The worms themselves could draw inspiration from any number of literature, movies, or folklore, considering how often we see giant worms. The most likely reference, though, is actually the purple worm from Dungeons & Dragons, which was introduced over a decade prior to Final Fantasy I's release. There are plenty of folklores and stories about giant worms in the sand, or giant worms in general. Hell, Beetlejuice comes to mind. But considering how much D&D shaped the culture of modern-day RPGs, I feel it's only fair to give them credit for Final Fantasy's worms. The first time we see any form of worm in Final Fantasy is actually in Final Fantasy I, where the purple worm enemies were present in the Chaos Shrine. Even though they were originally called worms in the NES version, they were purple worms, so in case there were any doubts about D&D being the reference for these creatures, there you go. There was also lava and sandworms and even an abyss worm in the remakes. These creatures started a monster trend that would carry through pretty much every Final Fantasy title afterwards. As the games go on, several variants of these worms would be introduced. You have the Gigas worm, you have round worms, blood worms, flood worms, horn worms, etc, etc. In Final Fantasy V, the sandworm is actually a boss that you have to play a good old ATB version of Whack-A-Mole with, where he hides and reappears from different holes in the arena, something that we will revisit in later series versions. In Final Fantasy VI, though, the Zone Eater worm gave sandworms a new purpose: hidden dungeons. The Zone Eater that is encountered on Triangle Island is actually not meant to be killed, but instead you're supposed to let him eat you. This pulls you into its stomach and allows you to rescue Gogo, an optional party member in one of the game's optional dungeons. While other worms in the game are still present and quite threatening, this idea of swallowing party members would become something that different Final Fantasy games would toy with here and there. Sometimes the sandworm will teleport you to a dungeon of some kind, and other times they'll simply swallow a party member so you can't use them for several turns, such as in Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy XI would introduce two different variants of the worm, one small and immobile and one large and mysterious. The regular landworm type enemies are just worms that burrow in and out of the ground. They can't move once you start attacking them, but they do have access to powerful earth magic should their prey run too far. The other variant is the sandworm itself, which is more of a reference to the Zone Eater from Final Fantasy VI. This giant world boss has no loot and exists for one purpose: to consume an entire alliance of party members and allow them to fight the boss within the worm's innards. Within the boss, depending on where he actually eats you, he'll bring you to one of several of the original game's optional bosses, though they'll be bumped up in difficulty to match level 75. Sometimes, however, you'll instead encounter a lambton worm inside of the sandworm itself. Now, the lambton worm is actually in reference to a story from the 15th century involving a worm that a small boy dropped into a well after he decided to go fishing instead of going to church. He is warned by one of the locals, however, he completely ignores them and just does as he will. After several years, the worm grows large and escapes the now poisoned well to terrorize the nearby villages. Eventually, the boy's father begins offering a tribute to the worm to quell its rage while the nearby villages rally up to kill the beast, though unsuccessfully. It is eventually slain by the boy who captured him in the first place, though the creature curses him and his family for 9 generations, disallowing them from having peaceful deaths. Unfortunately, after this appearance, sandworms were fairly absent from Final Fantasies 12 and 13, not returning to the main series until Final Fantasy 14 as just worms out in the world. Some of them were bosses, some of them were non-bosses, but they hold no really special value in Final Fantasy 14. While they may not be too active in the main series anymore, they are regulars in pretty much every spin-off and non-numbered title in Final Fantasy history, posing just as much a threat as they ever did. I'm hoping we'll get to see them in Final Fantasy 15, and perhaps that'll have an update for this video when that happens. Thank you for watching this episode of Final Fantasy Bestiary. Special shout out to our Patreon supporters for making sure that the return of this series could be imminent. If you enjoy the YouTube channel and you'd like to see more content or a greater variety of content, be sure to check that out. Completely optional, but it does help incentivize videos like this to return to the channel or for new videos to be made in the first place. Anyway, be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for the next Final Fantasy Bestiary. Until then, take care.